Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 9th meeting in 2013 of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. As usual, can I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please. Agenda item 1 is Public Services Reform and Local Government Strand 3, Developing New Ways of Delivering Services. We have an oral evidence session this morning on local government benchmarking. As part of the third strand of this inquiry into public service reform, the committee agreed to revisit this important local government project once the benchmarking data had been published, which took place last week. Can I therefore welcome to the committee Ronnie Hines, past Chair of the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, Colin Mayer, Chief Executive of the Improvement Service, and Mark McAteer, Director of Governance and Performance Management at the Improvement Service. Gentlemen, do you have any opening remarks that you'd like to make to the committee?
Yes, thank you, Chair. We've agreed a small division of labour in terms of some opening remarks. I think the interest, as we've been advised at this point, is how we take the project forward, so our opening remarks will be built around that. I would just want to make perhaps 2 or 3 points. You will be aware that the project was launched a couple of weeks ago at the COSLA conference. Some of you may have looked at the data that's on the Improvement Service website. That, as we've always said, marks a significant stage, but only the first stage really in the journey that we're on with benchmarking. And perhaps for me, the key things that we want to be taking forward from this point on, I would summarise as saying, first of all, we need to embed the practice. So one of the things that we'll be working on with the Improvement Service is establishing some systems around that, and that for me means families of councils who would work together on a collaborative basis in order to make use of this data and drive improvement by utilising it. So that's the first thing. It would be establishing some kind of systematic approach, and families would be key to that. I think the second thing, and if you've looked at the data, you can probably see where I'm coming from here. There are still some gaps. We've always said that the 55 or so indicators that we have, even at the high level, don't cover everything that councils are responsible for. There are still some conspicuous areas that are relatively silent. Economic development would be an example of that. So the second strand of development really is to flesh the indicators out and make sure that we do cover everything for which councils are responsible. And perhaps the last thing that I would say is that we see this as being quite a significant stepping stone in its own right to further embedding of benchmarking and comparative use of data for good practice across the public sector. So although we've quite a long way still to go in terms of using it within local government, we have aspirations to take it beyond that and to combine it with similar exercises that we know happen perhaps in the health service, and broadly speaking try to take that into community planning. So those for me would be perhaps the key points in terms of how we see this being taken forward from this point on, Chair.
Thank you. Colin or Mark, do you wish to add to that?
Just a couple of things, Chair. Just to say that obviously if any of you have had a chance to view the website itself, that the website will also be subject as part of the project to ongoing improvement itself, and other materials will feature on the website going forward. So things like the case studies that will come out from some of the work that Ronnie was talking about, they'll also feature as part of the website as we go forward. On that process that Ronnie mentioned around how councils will work together, again, we're clear with COSLA and Solace that there'll be a standard process for councils to go through so that we can help support that process of investigation with the councils into why the variation occurs, and then capture the learning that comes out of that so that that can be shared across all 32 councils. The indicators themselves, as Ronnie said, will be reviewed to make sure that they are both fit for purpose going forward as well as plugging the gaps, and to ensure that the data sources that we need going forward are robust and secure for the project itself. Another area we've had some discussion, again maybe we pick up with yourselves, is the ongoing involvement of elected members as part of the process. You'll have seen obviously the briefing note that was prepared by COSLA, and we'll produce similar materials and run workshops with members, both cross-council to bring them together around benchmarking, but also if requested within councils where we can go and work with the members so that they get better sense of what is this data telling them about their authority and how the improvement process will work going forward. And then just very briefly, that last point, again, I think Ronnie touched upon about how will this connect into improvement processes themselves. So If it's just interesting data that doesn't actually do anything to help drive improvement, then we've failed as a project. So there will be an ongoing stream of work about how does this now feature within improvement planning within councils, so that as service plans are created, that data is helping feed into that process, so that services themselves are picking it up, dealing with it, picking up the case study examples of good practice, and then embedding it in within their own authority. So again, there'll be a piece of work that will be built around that going forward. So that's just a short opening statement.
Before I bring in Stuart Stevenson, could you give us an idea of the buy-in that there's been from political and officer leadership, and also what staff in the front line are thinking around about this particular benchmarking project?
I mean, at this stage, I suppose it's difficult to say with any great detail because we've only launched a week and a half ago. But I think the last time we had a look at the stats on the website, we've had over 1,000 hits on the website, and I think we've had something like 15,000 downloads from the website so far within a week and a half of launch. Now, I can't tell you, because we can't track the information, who those people are who've hit. So I couldn't tell you if it's council staff, is it members of the public, because we've got no way of tracking the individuals. We can just track the overall numbers. But so far, I mean, in comparison to our general improvement service website, that dwarfs anything that we would get in a month, never mind in a week and a half period. So it's had some high degree of initial impact, at least in terms of awareness, but it's something I think that we would like to try and track with both politicians, officers and frontline staff going forward. I think it's certainly an important point, and we'll take note of that.
Although it's only been launched for a week and a half, there's been quite a long lead-in. So you must have some kind of indication about the leadership aspects in terms of council leaders and senior officers. Are they sold on this benchmarking project?
I can respond to that. I'll give you a perspective from my own council because I think it's representative. I can't speak with authority for the other 31. In fact, this afternoon when I leave here, I'll be going back to a meeting with my Chief Officer group, and at their request, we've put benchmarking on the agenda for that because we want to discuss how best to embed it into the ongoing performance management processes within the council. And talking to my fellow chief executives, I think that's pretty indicative of where this is going. The profile that we've now got with this, partly because of your own interest in it, I have to say, has served well to make people think, okay, we've got this, as Mark has said, how best might we use it? At a political level, I can speak partly from my own council, but perhaps more widely, my own leader and the administration as a whole are very interested in this, and so in fact so are all the political groups. And they want to see how it can be built into the ongoing scrutiny processes that we run within the council, and we're discussing how best to achieve that. More broadly, I think you've been written to by the President of COSLA, and I think that represents where politically local government is with this. It was initiated, as you know, by chief executives, but in the last year there's been significant pickup at a political level, and I expect to see nothing but further development of that.
Thank you. Colin?
Thank you. Just a point about your right point about the long gestation of this. One merit of that was a very large number of staff across all 32 councils were involved in the preparation of data, the standardisation of data and so on. So there's probably an awareness level around this across staff in councils that wouldn't have happened if we'd simply dragged it into a corner, done all ourselves and then bounced them with it. So this is something that has been participatively generated and has now much more awareness. Just to echo Ronnie's point in discussion with a number of chief exec colleagues across councils, many have said that they intend to use it by taking kind of 6 areas they regard as key, where their performance relatively is not what they'd want, and target those for improvement in the first year of this being available, and have discussions with all the relevant staff across their council as to why variation in performance in comparison to other councils is occurring. So I think there is a degree of publicity around this. I think there's a degree of awareness around it, but I think there's also a commitment from Ronnie's colleagues to use it in quite an intensive way to reshape their own improvement activities.
And just lastly, on the officials, the officers and staff side of things, we set up a knowledge hub, which is a kind of learning platform that allows for electronic exchange between people so that we don't always have to be physically together in a room to discuss things. And I think we've got over 200 officers signed up to that knowledge hub, and all 32 councils are represented on it. And a quick skim through their profiles, we do have officers from a finance background, corporate performance background, but increasingly also service background themselves. So kind of point that Ronnie was making, as it's become aware within a service that the corporate centre of the council is looking at this material, we've had requests from colleagues at service level to join that knowledge hub, and that's been granted to them, so they've got access to all the material and then can start to exchange through that hub as well.
Stuart Stevenson first, please.
Thank you very much. I'll just start with a wee observation. Slightly surprised you don't know who's visiting your website now. At the end of the session, I'll give you a little free bit of code you can put on your website that will help you do that. I know who visits every page of my 2,850-page website, and it doesn't cost me a penny. However, that's for another time. I want to preface my set of questions by saying I'm not wanting to engage in the detail of the data in asking my questions, because I think that would just divert us off from the main thrust of the things that we should be taking an interest in, even though they might tempt you to do so. The first thing is, looking at the generality of the graphs, I can immediately conclude, correctly or incorrectly, I'm not interested particularly in examining, that in councils that look to me as if they ought to be similar, there are divergences in performance in some headings. So my question is, has that already, as part of the process of producing this and publishing this data in the way it has, have you got evidence that that's leading to councils picking up the opportunity, and I use that word quite deliberately, that there is for a council when it sees it's a bit above what it might think to be the line? Is that now happening?
Who's going first on that one, gentlemen? Ronnie.
I'll essay a response to that. It is early, I think, to give a comprehensive answer to that. So I'll offer a perspective from my own organisation, and we'll see if the Improvement Service can say something more general. I know that, I'll give an example. Examples always help, but we do want to stay out of the detail of the data. If I look at it from a Fife perspective, one of the things that I can see is that on one of the key measures of attainment, which is SQ8 level 5, we're still not where we would want to be. We're somewhere around the Scottish average, and I suppose broadly in demographic and other terms, Fife is very representative of Scotland, so that doesn't surprise me. However, in educational terms, we're somewhere below that, not hugely, but significantly. So already that's led to dialogue, as you can imagine, within my own organisation. And one of the things that we have done with this data is just to use the sheer comparison before we can get to the point where we can sit down with some of the other councils that we would think are comparable to us in social and economic terms, and ask what they're doing that's different to what we're doing. Even before we get to that, the sheer comparison is enough to provoke people, if you like, in what I regard as quite a constructive way. So my Director of Education is now looking very hard at why we are below that point, even allowing for the social characteristics of Fife. And one of the things that we have done, and I'll spare you the detail, is he sat down with the 19 secondary head teachers and said, we've been saying for 5 or 6 years now that although we're improving, we're not breaking through. Even that average never made anything higher than that. Why is that? And we've undertaken quite a specific targeted initiative with those head teachers, with a cohort of pupils in mind who we know, all things being equal, could just about manage to get 5+ at that level. But they may not get there because they didn't last year or their equivalents didn't, and now we push that.
I suspect, without going further, we've got the point.
Yeah.
Fife has done that, and I'm quite happy with the subjective answer to this. Do you think other councils are at this time already doing that sort of thing that's relevant to their interests?
I'm sure they are.
I mean, certainly when we launched the website with all the content at the COSLA IES conference a week and a half ago, I had a discussion with a number of chief executives. So, for example, I do know that Glasgow is doing some work at corporate management team level with Edinburgh City Council using the benchmarking indicators, and also with North Lanarkshire Council. And they're I think picked about half a dozen of the indicators from across the suite to focus on initially to get into that discussion that you're saying. What we want to do, I think, as Ronnie and I were saying at the beginning, is to now put more of a managed process around some of that. Now, we would never stop councils talking to one another, sharing perspectives, etc., and sharing learning with one another. We want to get more of a managed arrangement around it, hence the development of the family groups, and then a consistency of process about how we now get stuck into that detail. So in future months and years, we'll be able to report much more systematically about what's happened as a consequence.
Okay, that's fine. I've just got a couple more points. I do want to pick up on what you said, Mr. Hines. You used the word significantly below. I just want to be clear, because I'm a pedant, whether you're using the word significant in a statistical sense, and if you are, is the data in the way it's presented, which will have imperfections in it, are we able to understand what is statistically significant about variations? Or is it simply, and this is not a bad thing, so I don't phrase this to suggest it is, that simply looking at it is energising people to take action on an area irregardless of the statistical significance of a variation that might be displayed?
Just to respond to my account, yes. First of all, I think not everybody will look at it with that fine-grained statistical mind, if you like, but it doesn't matter. So long as they see the differences in their own terms and act on them, that's the key point. When I used it, I was thinking, as it happens, of an example where we are statistically below where we should be, not just in terms of the average, but in terms of councils that I consider to be comparable, allowing for the various factors that I referred to, who are outstripping the norm. So they're doing better than they should be, in quotes. I want to know why, and that difference is statistically significant.
That's good. I think Mr. Mayor was fidgeting to
Yeah, no, sorry, I just fidget, I apologise. I wrote the overview report, which may have remedied insomnia for people around the room if they've read it, and we did look in some depth at statistical relationships across the data, and I think some of the things that will energise will not be those statistical relationships. So, for example, the pattern of relationship between the level of deprivation within a council and educational attainment within that council is long established, and indeed I think becomes more dispiriting over time than necessarily energising. I think one of the interesting things from discussions with chief executive colleagues is councils who have very limited amounts of deprivation are often doing very interesting things with children from deprived backgrounds. And now, the most logical benchmarking family for Glasgow wouldn't be East Renfrewshire. On the other hand, it is interesting to say, well, fine, albeit it's got a very low overall level of deprivation, how come they're doing so well with children who are nevertheless from very disadvantaged backgrounds? So I think energy can come with the statistical trend, but it can also come by thinking beyond the statistical trend. I think quite hearteningly, people are probably looking at both. So they are taking a best-in-class view that goes somewhat beyond purely, I only look at councils who are like my council. Well, actually, if other councils are doing really interesting things, you wouldn't want to miss the learning opportunity as you expressed it around that.
Right, and finally, and I think this can be dealt with relatively concisely, the other comparison, just superficially I'm making looking at things, is on single areas within a council where there's a significant divergence between the adjacent years. And at the moment we've only 2 years data, so I would need to be extremely cautious, but in 1 or 2 cases very big variations. Are we satisfied that such variations are proper in relation to the normalisation of data that's been undertaken? Are they exaggerated? Because we've perhaps still further things to do in looking at normalisation of data. Do we understand, or are the councils likely to understand, perhaps that it's a policy change that's caused that change, or is it a change in performance? What sort of questions is there evidence that such year-on-year variations? I do note that some of the bigger ones are in some of the smaller councils, and I can see why that might be the case. But are we satisfied that that comparison is leading to questions? Because I express a view here that the whole point about this is for councils to be asking themselves questions.
No, I would absolutely agree with that, and I think you very astutely identified that the really striking variations are year on year in small councils. I think they're also in areas where it's frankly hard to standardise in making year on year comparisons. So if I take costs within childcare and child protection, there are some quite striking figures in there. But one year you may have a case of a kid who has very severe personality, physical and other difficulties, as well as learning disabilities, that may require a very significant investment if that child is of any chance in life at all. And next year you don't have such a case, and I think if you had Ronnie and his colleagues in, a very small number of cases on the childcare side can bust budgets, frankly, here. So because you need to respond to the actual needs of that child. So I think in a way making the year-on-year comparison then becomes slightly suspect, because it's the pattern of need that's being identified each year that leads to that variation. In terms of normalisation, we obviously checked very closely with councils that some of the more spectacular outlier figures weren't just recording errors and so on. So we have gone through a process on that. But I think there are some areas where the variation year on year is so strong that maybe us presenting this as a unit cost is frankly misleading rather than helpful. And I think the child protection area is probably, or child care area is probably the best example of that.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald, please. Remiss of me not to say that Mark MacDonald was substituting for Stuart McMillan today. You're very welcome. You make 6 ex-councillors out of 7 folk in the committee now, so Mark, do you want to proceed?
Thank you very much, Convener. And to think I thought I'd escaped from your clutches when we left Aberdeen City Council, but there we go. In terms of how this translates into improved outcomes, because at the end of the day that's the focus, and it should be the focus, is that gathering data and sharing data is all fine and dandy, but unless we actually start to see improved outcomes for communities, for individuals, then all the data in the world isn't going to make a jot of difference. So I just wonder if maybe you could highlight where you see improved outcomes coming from this. I mean, there has been benchmarking in the past, obviously. It's not a new concept. The way it's being done perhaps now is different to how it was done in the past. And I know in the COSLA connections that we've had placed before us, that it says benchmarking should support change and improvement based upon knowledge about best practice. I guess my question to you would be, how do we ensure that it's not just that it should, but that it does?
Who's first? Ronnie?
Quite happy to start. I go back to my opening remarks to some extent. Let's recognise the limitations of what we've done here, because the genesis of this lay in a time before outcomes were quite as prominent in the landscape as they are just now. We've targeted service improvement and cost reduction. Now, they're not unrelated to outcomes, but I think there's more to do if you're going to achieve outcomes. So for me, and I've always said this about this project, a significant part of the benefit is just the practice that it establishes of doing this kind of work, making these kind of comparisons, collaborating with each other to find out why it is that something's been done apparently better in another place than it is here. Once those habits are ingrained, they will apply just as well to work through community planning partnerships, for example, that is much more closely and directly related to outcomes. But having said that, and you can see for yourself from some of the data, a number of these do touch directly on outcomes. If we improve educational attainment more quickly using this than we would have done without it, then surely that's a better outcome for the children who attend our schools. So I wouldn't sell the project short in that regard, but I think it's the habit and the practice that we build on here that will deliver against outcomes.
I think your point's very well made, and therefore requires a robust improvement process within councils. Mark will correct me if I get this statistic wrong, but 21 councils using a common self-assessment and improvement planning process, which we work with them and support, but they also have a network to support themselves. We see benchmarking as fitting into that. It's not a substitute for other forms of self-assessment. It augments and creates opportunities for identifying improvement within existing forms of self-assessment and so on. So I think it's important to say that this is one bit of a jigsaw, but it's by no means all, and unless it is underpinned by a robust commitment to use comparisons for improvement purposes. So if I take the education example we've talked about, the use of kind of ambition plans for children in deprived areas would be harder to run if you have a massive amount of deprivation than you have a smaller amount, but it's still a very interesting construct that rather than saying these children are deprived, therefore they will almost certainly fail in the education system, we do quite the opposite. We start out with very coherent planning for these individual children, and we run that through the system, and we monitor very tightly whether they are developing the way we'd want them to develop, having the opportunities they need to have to do that, and so on. So it's picking up from the comparison statistical. We'll find what underpins that, though. How do you get very good results with deprived children within an education system, and are there transferable elements here that councils can share with each other that will allow all people to benefit from the insights that some councils have had in that respect? I think Ronnie's final point is really important. All of the work, and this committee will be very familiar with it, that's been done in health inequalities, educational inequalities and so on, has tended to emphasise that no one service in isolation could conceivably crack that. So health inequalities are not down to the healthcare system. They're driven by a whole lot of other economic and social factors that influence people's health outcomes. That is also true of children's attainment within school. So the bit that Rory emphasised is deduction, that improvement has to happen within community planning and the sharing of services between agencies, not simply within councils. And some of the big impacts we need to have will be about the better coordination across public services, as well as better coordination within public services.
I guess one of the other points that I would make is that there's a mindset issue here as well, beyond simply the collation of benchmarking, looking at benchmarking and saying, oh, they're doing well, why are they doing well? There's a mindset issue, which is that for whatever, however much we might hope otherwise, individuals, whether they be council officials, whether they be council leaders, whether they be councillors, often have a reluctance to admit that the approach that they have taken has not delivered the best results. And there is often a sort of a territorial position that is taken that what they are doing is the best thing to be doing. So what work is being done to try and get beyond that mindset and bring people together to ensure that they are actually sharing best practice where best practice does exist?
To pick up the point that Colin made around the councils who use the Public Service Improvement Framework, 21 of them. Other councils use similar frameworks, so there's support from ourselves to both camps, if you like. What we'll be doing with those councils is working to ensure that this data and information features as part of the exercises that they go through when they're using those self-evaluation frameworks. They're based on the EFQM model. So they take that information and then they'll start to look at it in terms of things like the business process. How does that connect to what this picture, what this information is telling us? How does leadership work in this organisation, and how does that relate to the results that this information is telling us? And they will systematically work their way through that over a period of time to interrogate themselves, but share practice and learning with one another as well across those 21 councils. So this will actively be part of that improvement level discussion within councils going forward. And the other bit is just general training and development, because I think you're absolutely right in what you say around, if you like, the cultural aspects here. Data and information in and of itself isn't enough if people don't engage and take the learning from that and then translate that into change within their service, their organisation, their partnership. So there will be training and development opportunities for elected members around this, but also through some of the other work that the IS leads on behalf of councils for officers and officials as well, so that it's there to help kind of pick up that culture that I think that you're alluding to needs to be in place in order to kind of make that translation from just interesting data to real change, real improvement.
One of the things which the committee has stated before is that we would be very interested in going to some of these training events for elected members, so that we get a clear indication of how folks are feeling about it and what is actually being done to educate people. Mr. MacDonald.
Yeah, no, just one final question, convener. In the community planning partnerships were were raised, and I suppose it won't come as a big shock that I'm going to refer to the Audit Scotland report that's out today, which indicates that community planning partnerships, despite having had statutory basis for 10 years, that there's still a feeling that they're not able to show that they've had a significant impact in delivering improved outcomes. How do you see the approach on benchmarking being fed into the community planning partnership system and ensuring that where partners are working together, they're using that data appropriately and then actually starting to deliver or at least demonstrate delivery?
Just 2 points. I think the Audit Scotland report is very, very useful because it challenges head on the degree to which community planning has added value and will, if we carry on as we are doing, add value in the future. So I think it's a head-on challenge to the system. You'll be aware that it arose itself out of a process of review and reform of community planning that's going ahead presently. Part of that approach has led to the development of a group to provide simply better local evidence both of need and performance across the whole of Scotland that's available to community planning partnerships. And I think perhaps one of Ronnie's introductory points that the reason the publication of this first iteration of the benchmarking framework is important is it's published. It is not something that's been done and then shared surreptitiously between councils. It is something that was done with a commitment. We stick it in the public domain. Part of the challenge that flows out of that is people can then monitor whether you've changed over time or you haven't. I mean, that's why we need to get better outcome measures, because the critical thing is, are the outcomes, are people's lives getting better over time, not merely a certain process statistics getting better over time. And I think the same applies to community planning partnerships. So there was a very significant engagement just now between ourselves and a variety of other bodies, Health Scotland, Health Improvement Scotland, and so on, to say, let us work together to make the best information about need and performance available at local level, so people can actually see where they stand, but make it possible to compare communities within a local area as well as compare between different areas of Scotland, because often the variations within a community planning area are much more striking than the variations between it and other parts of Scotland. So there's a lot of work going on just now to make that type of data available. And it flows out partly the Audit Scotland report, all community planning partnerships will be challenged to have an improvement process. They will all be scrutinised over time externally, so that there will be a pressure there to demonstrate they actually understand what they're doing, they are driving the resources behind their priorities, they are doing systematic improvement planning, and they are developing. So I think we've moved from a situation where we'd kind of lost impetus to a situation where there are strenuous efforts at national level through both Scottish Government and local government at national level, Solace and COSLA, to put impetus now back behind community planning, but that then means it has to improve. The strap line in the statement of ambition about community planning from ministers and COSLA was that it must make demonstrable improvements to people's lives. And I think measuring demonstrable improvement over time becomes the key way then of driving that process.
Yeah, you mentioned quite rightly that the outcomes are the key, and it's not just about having a range of statistics there. Of the 55 measures, and you'll have to forgive me because as I'm a substitute here, this may have been rehearsed before, but of the 55 measures that are being benchmarked, how many of those would be classed as inputs and how many of those would be classed as outcomes?
I would say about 80% are input/output measures, and about 20% presently are any sort of measure of outcome. Indeed, we've noted at the end of the overview report that in a range of respects, if I just take a very simple example, in terms of linking inputs to outcomes for children, we're at S4 before we've any ability to do that on a standard basis at the present moment. So there is real work to be done in improving on that, and indeed there's a section at the end of the overview report saying, you know, here are the key things in the development programme for next year. Equally, if the outcomes are the public's satisfaction and sense of well-being, we have as yet no consistent way of measuring that either, and that's inadequate and that needs remedied as well. So your question is pointed and valid.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you would like to see that balance shifting over time as this project develops?
Absolutely shift. I think the aim was to link cost to outcomes. We have put a lot of effort and have now got, I think, to very comparable costs for the first time they're pretty standard. You can make realistic comparisons between councils. I think it is the outcome area that this suite remains deficient in.
Just to kind of add to that, as Colin said, there's a lot of work going on in a variety of groups. There was a group set up last year called the Improving Evidence and Data Group, which brings together public sector partners from right across CPPs with Scottish Government analysts. And that's one of the things that we've been charged in that group to look at, is developing, building on the work that we've done in benchmarking, a framework that will support benchmarking within community planning partnerships. So it's certainly part of the ongoing development around community planning, and some of the insights and learning that we've had from developing this process will certainly be fed into that process, as we will also talk to other partners. So, for example, the NHS has its own benchmarking arrangements, and we've already set up dialogue about exchange of learning between us and them. So both between services, but critically in partnership, is certainly something that we will be working on in the period ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Before I bring in Margaret Mitchell, I think that the last point that you made about benchmarking by other public bodies, a huge amount of what we're about to embark on in terms of integration of services in health and social care, for example, it would be a pointless scenario if we're measuring a huge amount of different things. One of the difficulties that there always was in terms, or one of the things which was always said was a difficulty in terms of dealing with some aspects of community planning partnerships, was the fact that a number of the measures and targets that were used by the health service and budgeting came in at a different time from local authorities. Heat targets were always given as an excuse in terms of being incapable of measuring or seeing what was going on in certain areas. How are we going to ensure that the data that we are using in this benchmarking process actually matches up with some of the stuff that's going on in the health service at this moment in time, so when we do get that greater integration, you know, we're not measuring different things all over the place and not and actually hitting the nail in the head in terms of what we actually want to see.
Clearly at the moment within the framework we have some measures for health and social care, more on the social work end of the spectrum, but it's something that we know we're going to have to factor in going forward. So at the moment there's development work around what will be the likely outcomes around health and social care and what will be the likely performance and measurement framework around that. As that clarifies over the next period, that will be built into our framework so that it is there and reflected in what we do. Your more general point, I think, Chair, around making sure that data across different services is planned better so that it's there, available at the right points in time for people, that we've got some degree of consistency in timing between health data being published, local government data being published and so forth. That's certainly something that we've already had discussions with Scottish Government officials around, and that's something we'll continue to press for, because as we move down into much more shared services, joint integrated work and so forth, that will become absolutely imperative in order to maintain a kind of performance framework such as this or any others that emerge over time. So I think your points are absolutely well made, and it's certainly stuff that we've been picking up with officials within Scottish Government.
I'm sure that we're going to come back to that in the future. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Can I say at the outset that the Local Government Benchmarking Framework overall report, I think, was quite a fair analysis and very helpful analysis of the work carried out. However, I think it would be helpful, without going into specifics exactly, to look at areas where you have said that taking into account key factors, there are still variations that need to be explored further, particularly environmental services under waste collection, road maintenance, total road maintenance, the cost per kilometre maintained, and support services where you helpfully do say that, well, we need to look at the organisation and practice. Where are you going maybe with the first two that I mentioned, environmental services and road maintenance?
With that one. And again, it's interesting what proves to be controversial within benchmarking and trying to get data together and what doesn't. One of the things you'll note we haven't done, and I think this is to the detriment of councils who have sought to recycle more, is we have not taken account of the income generated through recycling. So we're expressing the gross cost, not the netted off cost to the council of delivering the service. And it's fair to say, for understandable reasons, some colleagues around Scotland are modestly teed off with that because they feel you begin to make it look as if you're doing the right thing in outcome terms, which is also economically efficient because it generates business opportunities and income flows. If you don't capture the income that flows out of that, you then make that council look more extravagant rather than proper. We could not arrive within the timescale at a way of accurately estimating that income and netting it off. But so I think some of the comparisons there are just of gross cost and may therefore, in one sense, where you get a low cost without an outcome against it, some of the practice in low-cost councils may be disastrous long-term.
So it's a process of elimination.
It is a process of elimination, and I think the reason we've said these are very high-level measures you need to drill down from, the councils know that detail. We have struggled to standardise it in time to get it into this framework, but they know that detail, and as part of their comparisons with each other, they would need to take that into account. So if people were still routinely using landfill, that is not something this committee or any other committee of the Scottish Parliament wish to encourage. It's not something in line with local government or national government policy in Scotland. And therefore people who are currently making the investment, which often means your cost of waste collection goes up because you're asking the household to sort at source, but you're then having to run multiple collections. If we just went back to saying just heave it all into a big grey bin and we'll bury it somewhere around the countryside, well, that's quite cheap, but it's not sustainable and it's not long-term desirable in terms of the outcome. So in that one, and I hope it does come through in the text, that we are anxious about how good a report that presently. I mean, it's accurate in terms of gross cost, but whether it's actually expressing anything terribly helpful. On the roads, I think, and again, weirdly, this has been a very much explored and discussed matter over time, as your advisor will know in his former role as both a civil servant and a chief executive, that it is an area where, yes, you can explain some variation in terms of traffic volumes, but there's still a lot of unexplained variation that is to do with practice. And it's certainly an area where there's quite a drive on just now to say, actually, with some service sharing make more sense here. Is everybody maintaining their own depots, their own fleets and so on, a remotely sustainable thing if you take a 5-year view in that? So we hope some of this won't just get people to make comparisons, how does my council stack, but to see opportunities, as Mr Stevenson said at the beginning, that are more about, actually, I'd quite like to work with them. Because if we work together in this, we can take some of these costs out mutually, but still deliver a decent road service to the public. Again, it's an area where we are lacking quality measures, and I'll leave you to make your own judgment as you drive around your constituencies as to whether the lowest cost council offers the best and safest road service to its public.
Certainly, I'm aware in some councils they were able to do this very quickly with some kind of new method. Now, that must have been quite cost efficient as well as very efficient for the drivers. So is that repeated throughout? How effective? So I suppose it's just
that's what we hope will be picked up through this framework. If people adopted technologies and techniques that allow them to respond both very quickly and quite cheaply. If that's the case, the other bit we need to capture is the upfront investments people have to make to get to those technologies. There are some remarkable roads maintenance technologies now, but they are vastly expensive to get into, though they pay for themselves over a 10-year period, and therefore monitoring some of that is something the framework will also have to adjust to take place. On the support costs, the one thing that's very clear to us is the democratic core costs of councils do vary with scale and are very, very high in the context of very small councils, because often they are representing very diffuse communities. You have quite a large number of elected members, even though the overall population size is small, because we've chosen to have democratic representation that way, and therefore as a proportion of their costs, the democratic core looks very much higher. Clearly, if you spread that across a population the scale of Glasgow, you're getting more economy of scale out of elected members than you can in the Western Islands or Orkney or Shetland. So, and I think that's been noted in the past and indeed consciously protected by governments in the past, because we do want that pattern of local political representation across remote, rural and island communities.
If I could just explore the issue of leadership. I mean, Mr Hines says, as mentioned in 5, they're not happy with some of the figures. They'll go off and do that on their own. But who's driving this across the 32 local authorities? And just to go back to the CPP issue, given that local authorities are seen as really the key driver very often in CPPs, and they are delivering a fair chunk of public services, is benchmarking going to apply to them? Because hoping they all cooperate, it sounds a little airy-fairy to me, because we know they're not. Another key thing that the committee has a huge concern about is engagement with the public. We found 9 times out of 10 they didn't even know about CPPs. So how are the public being brought into this? How's the data being used? And to what extent are the CPPs, subject to benchmarking too?
I think I'll take one bit of that, Ronnie take the other. This is an initiative that was driven by the 32 chief executives of Scotland's councils together. It has been discussed at every single one of their monthly branch meetings for far longer than we'd all prefer to get to this point. So there's been a very high level of engagement. So I think in terms of the executive leadership being committed, and I think the decision to publish genuinely was the critical one, because once it's out there, the question one asks next year, once we've got 3 years data, is why is this not improving? So I think the challenge has been built into the act of publication itself. With community planning partnership, I think the big shift across the next year will be that up until now we've had the 203 Act, and that said that councils are obliged to put in place a process, and a number of named statutory partners were obliged to participate in it. And in fairness, everybody has done both of those things. A change in law is being proposed, and I think it's been agreed between Scottish Government and local government, that there should be a duty on all public partners across the public sector to work together to improve outcomes. Now, none of us have had a duty to improve outcomes up until now. Indeed, if you look at most local government law, people have a duty to make arrangements for the education of children. They have no duty to do it successfully. They've just a duty to put in place arrangements for the education of children. So I think actually putting into the face of law that every public agency in Scotland has a duty to work with other public agencies to improve creates a statutory framework, which is much harder to duck working together, but equally very hard not to work together with communities, because the honest truth is all of our evidence is unless we are working in different ways with communities, we will not improve their outcomes. So in that sense, I think, though one doesn't want to exaggerate the importance of statute, I think the fact we've all been completely separately mandated in the past with no common duty, it's actually helpful to move to a common duty that is in fact expressed in terms of outcomes, and I think that will put a driver into the system. It will also allow external scrutiny bodies to be much more challenging of partnerships than they've been able to be up until now, because there's a binding statutory duty across all the public sector partners. So I think it will open up and force a lot of the issues that you've
convinced myself.
in terms,
Supplementary there, I think. Anne.
Really, it's just on the back of that question, how will that be measured and monitored, that the public information campaign, how will that run, and who will be the leaders of that?
Public information campaign. It's worth going back a step. The original concept for this was that all this information would form part of the public performance reports that we have a statutory duty as councils to produce. And that remains the intention for taking it forward. And the point of saying that is that that means that it's in the context of an individual council that this information really should carry weight. If you report for an individual council that your position against the other 32 or your closer comparators in various terms is what it is, then that's a drive to improvement for your council. So the point I'm really making here is that ultimately, improvement is the responsibility of an individual council and local authority. And I think that goes back to the previous question about leadership. There has to be some form of collective leadership, and as Colin said, there has been, to bring this project to this situation. But if you were sitting here with health authority chief executives, there would be a straightforward answer to that question, if you like, which is there is a chief executive of the health service in Scotland. There isn't such a thing for local governments, so necessarily the response has to be collective to some extent. But because of the nature of local government, the real drive for improvement and the reporting of it has to come from each individual council. This benchmarking data is a means to that end.
And Margaret Mitchell's other points, Ronnie, were you going to pick up on some of that?
Well, I think the other one is probably the CPPs, is that right? I reflected on the earlier discussion in relation to this. I think it would be fair to say, from my perspective, having worked with CPPs for a long time now, that the sheer effort that's required to bring collaboration to bear around the table has taken up a lot of our time and energy. So there's been little time left really for looking across the horizon to see what a CPP in some other part of the country might be achieving. It's hard enough to do within a council, being frank with you. That's partly why we chose to do this piece of work. But when you bind that up and talk about a community planning partnership, the effort, I think, unavoidably goes into how do we work better collaboratively with each other, in Fife in my case. So we've missed a trick, looking across the horizon to see what might be getting done differently and perhaps better elsewhere, and that represents a further level of challenge here. But I go back to what I said in my opening remarks. By doing this piece of work, by building on that and by integrating it, as Mark said, with what we know is happening in other parts of the public sector, we should be able to do that better. And we have to, because it's now, I think, increasingly in CPPs that the real delivery of benefits and outcomes is going to take place.
It's worrying, I have to say.
Stuart Stevenson.
In some of Mr Mayor's previous remarks in answer to my colleague on waste, there was a discussion about the absence of income being reflected in the figures, and that just led me to an important question. Is the presentation of income across the board a difficulty for councils because of potential commercial confidentiality in relation to people from whom the income is derived, relationships with commercial companies? And if that is the case, is there a mechanism by which councils can share commercially confidential information in a secure way that does not breach that? And if there isn't, are you going to do something about that?
The point, I think it's not always that this is commercially confidential. So at the end of the report, para 60, by which time most people have quite rightly fallen asleep, I have noted that 61, there's a whole lot of areas where costs and income are not well related to each other. So we're expressing the cost to the council without the income stream that follows.
Do forgive me, it's a very narrow question about just commercial confidentiality.
Commercial confidentiality would be narrowly the case in some cases around waste collection and disposal. I don't think it applies to sports and leisure services, where these are set up largely now as charitable trusts across Scotland. I think in social care it could be seen thus, but it shouldn't be in the future requirement for self-directed support.
Is there a mechanism
whereby
we can share data on commercial?
Absolutely. We have a part of the knowledge hub that Mark alluded to allows completely private space that nobody can access but key holders. So in that sense, it is there.
That's sufficient.
Brad, thank you. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Very interesting reading in relation to the data that's before us. Questions I would like to ask is, mentioned earlier, all three witnesses mentioned earlier about the buy-in by elected members. And the Improvement Services indicated that you circulated a publication to all elected members, local government elected members in Scotland. And I just want clarification. Do we have buy-in from the elected members? Is this agenda being driven at officer level and only officer level, with the carrot and stick approach being taken towards elected members? If they don't follow these benchmarking criteria and they don't try to address some of the issues, then there may be a big stick wielded against the elected members. And I would seek your opinion, gentlemen, in terms of that view.
Ronnie?
Well, yeah, I can give you a categorical assurance that elected members are fully on board with this.
I said all elected members.
well, I don't know all 1,223 of them, but as a group, they are definitely on board with this. You have to remember, it's, I think, rightly the case that this piece of work is led by officers because it's management stuff to begin with. It would be surprising, I think, if 32 council leaders had decided to do this. It is really within the remit of a chief executive to do this, and that's why it's been done that way. That doesn't mean that we've done it against the grain or against the tide, or the elected members are indifferent to this. They are not. But I think it has been because we had to bring it to a level of maturity and demonstrate that actually we could make it work before we could ask elected members to give it their endorsement. They have certainly done so. And it provides an enormously powerful piece of accountability for elected members, and they are very quick to see the potential of it. If you look at this data, as you clearly have done, you immediately have a question in your mind, as an elected representative, why is my council in this position rather than that one? And I think I've already seen it firsthand, and so have others, the demonstrable power of that in the hands of elected members. The added point, which has been made in Colin's earlier remarks, is that we made a decision that we wanted this to be public. And again, in terms of public accountability, that is clearly an issue for elected members. If you have to stand up in public and justify, explain or defend what this data tells you, then you are going to go back to your officers with double intensity and say, why is that the case? We knew that would be the consequence of doing this, but we think it's right to have done it. I'm absolutely clear that elected members know the value of this and that they know how to use it.
Sir Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. I was hoping Mr Mayor or Mr McAteer would respond to that.
I think I absolutely endorse what Ronnie said, and we've had a lot of interest in our discussions with elected members around this. I think where they will drive, as in I think implicitly the committee has this morning, frankly, is around outcomes. Partly what elected members want to know is life is improving and opportunities in life are improving for the people we serve in this area. And they would certainly raise, I think, the question Mr MacDonald raised about the balance of indicators. Tell us more about the impact we are positively having or failing to have in the area on people's lives, rather than just give us... So we are being challenged to move this thing on. Fine, this is a good start, but we need to get better on saying where the outcomes do lie here, and so members can be satisfied that across their administration, or if they're in opposition as they scrutinise, are things getting better here?
I'm going to stop here a minute because I think there's a point here, and I'm going to paraphrase what was said here at this committee by someone. And that was, when it came to performance indicators, councillors go through them as quickly as they possibly can. Now, that's not my experience because, well, I'm an anorak. But if that attitude exists in certain areas, I'm sure it's going to exist in many. And how do we get over that? In some regards, you know, how do we make this sexy? So that councillors actually do pay attention, I think, is the key thing.
Can I maybe pick that one up, Chair? I don't know if I can make it sexy, but I'll try my best. We've got a development programme in place for elected members, and I think 18 councils are now participating in it. So much of the material that's here will be repackaged in a way for learning purposes for those members who are signed up through that process. So there'll be a raft of materials that will be developed in the months ahead, targeted at members, but that will also be available to members who are not part of that programme.
Stop you again, Mark, because you know you've just said there will be a raft of materials.
Yep.
You know, elected members are busy people. We get rafts and rafts of certain things, and the more raft that you get in a particular subject, the less likely you are to delve in depth. So I think, you know, in terms of material production, I think we've got to be very careful.
We have a briefing series for elected members, and they are typically 4 pages to 5 pages maximum. And it will take an issue. What is the issue? What does it maybe raise as terms of questions for you as an elected member? And how can you now get further information? That's the broad template of it. So there'll be a series of those types of papers constructed from this data targeted at elected members across the country. We run a masterclass programme, which is a series of workshops. It works across councils, across parties, and that's programmed through to the summer. After the summer recess, when the next wave of masterclasses kick in, benchmarking and discussions with elected members will feature as part of that programme. So we can bring members physically together to maybe engage with some of the issues, including how might they now use some of this information as part of their internal challenge process, etc., within the council. That will be ultimately determined by them and the issues that they raise in turn with us. So there will be both written and learning materials for members and opportunities to engage with other councillors without officers present in the room. What does this tell us? What do we do? How do we pick this up? And we're there to help facilitate that kind of exchange between the councillors themselves.
Briefly, Mr Mayor, because I'm conscious that I interrupted John Wilson's line of questioning.
But I take on Mark's point, but I think critically here, certainly elected members I work most closely with, they want killer stuff. They want less and more important rather than more and less important. So there's a question here about how much data is presented and what it tells elected members about. If it tells them about real things about their area, my experience is they are hugely interested in that. If they feel it's a pile of management information that's relevant to a Tier 4 officer and not relevant to them at all, they are not interested at all. So part of the job here is to get the killer kits together for elected members. The things that really matter are really interesting and really engaging, and put that in front and engage with elected members around that.
Thank you, Convener. I'll try and stay away from the rafting, the whitewater rafting, or other the type of rafting, or the killer kits for councillors. The issue for me is that a lot of the decisions and a lot of the reporting that's came through in the benchmarking is cost-based. Local authorities, 32 local authorities, have a democratic process in which they will make budgetary decisions at the end of before the end of the financial year for the coming year. And some of the figures that we see before us clearly reflect on the budgetary decisions that have been made between 2010, 2011, 2012. Decisions to transfer, as you mentioned earlier, Mr Mayor, transfer leisure services out of council control to an arm's length trust, or other services to an arm's length trust, will show a decrease in cost. But there are still political decisions that some authorities make to retain services in-house rather than transfer them over. And if I look at cleansing, the uplifts that take place, some authorities continue to operate a weekly service, uplift service. Some authorities have moved to a 2-weekly uplift service. How do we measure the political decisions that are made by local authorities regarding the service delivery when you put it down into, effectively, in the benchmarking report, almost a pounds and pence cost per head? Where does because we did hear it previously when we took evidence last year on this, Councillor Cook from Scottish Borders Council clearly indicated that local authorities would still be in a position to make political decisions as they saw fit. But if you produce information like this, then surely there is greater pressure, or could be greater pressure, on local authorities to make political decisions based on the benchmarking evidence that's before them, and not looking at the quality of service that is being delivered to the residents and the people of those local authority areas.
Ronnie?
Thank you, Chair. I think that question goes to the heart of this issue in many ways. The short answer to the question, I think, is you do it by a process of elimination, because ideally how this ought to work is that by the time you've stripped out all the other causes of variation, whether it's largely uncontrollable circumstances to do with sheer geography or the level of deprivation in a given community, and by the time you take out the inefficiencies that the costs indicators are showing you, or the variations in performance that some of the other measures are showing you, what you should be left with are political differences. Now, that's an ideal world, and I recognise it's not going to be as simple as that, but that's the construct that we have here. And the purpose of this exercise is to allow us to better segregate those different components. Once we can control, if you like, for the variables that are, if you like, environmental, then we should be focusing in on those things that are under our control as managers in organisations and as political leaders as well. And if we do that, then the variations that remain should be because political choices have been made. And those political choices will reflect, obviously, a number of things, including geography and so on. So I think that's the key to this. We've never really been able to do that before without this kind of breakdown of the data, being frank about it. If somebody was challenged with a raw figure that said your indicator, whether it's in cost or performance terms, is this, but theirs is different and it's better, we could always excuse ourselves by saying, well, that's a matter of political choice. It may have been, but we never really knew, and this gives us a means of finding out. So I think part of the purpose of this is to be able to answer that question a little better than we were able to do in the past. In terms of the final part of the question, I actually don't think there is a risk that members, political members in my case, will steer by the wake, if you like, and make policy decisions based on benchmarking information. I think they will drive hard through accountability to people like me to eliminate waste and variance, but then they will make policy decisions based on the resources that are left to them, which is exactly what my experience to do.
Mr Mayor, Mr McAteer.
I mean, I absolutely agree with what Ronnie said, and I think that I would hope what this would do is to inform people about the costs of political choices. I mean, if I benchmark between the cost of care for an 80-year-old down south and an 80-year-old up here, you'd have to factor in the policy choice the Scottish Parliament's made about free personal care, which they haven't made down south. So a political choice has been made. That means a higher cost for us up here, but it's a cost we think is in line with our social values, our commitments to older people, and so on. I think there's nothing wrong with saying, however, there is a cost attaching to having those values, and that is a distinctive use of resources we're then choosing to make, and resources are overall finite. So that's a pile of cliches in a way, but you'll take the point. So I think this doesn't drive you down necessarily. I mean, I think one's worth looking at are things like museums. I mean, the honest truth is that the cost per visit at a museum is driven by the scale of visitor flow. So Glasgow spends a very large amount of money by Scottish standards on its museums and galleries, but it gets a staggeringly high visitor flow. So the cost per visitor is the most efficient looking in Scotland, if you like. Clearly, if you were running a museum that you think is culturally fantastically important in Orkney, you couldn't possibly achieve the sort of visitor flow you can achieve in the Borough Collection in Glasgow. So you are making a political choice that this thing really matters to your community. It celebrates an aspect of its life and its history. And you've invested. Clearly, there may come a point where you say, well, if nobody's going, though, actually, why are we running this thing? And if the unit cost gets up to a certain point, it alerts elected members that the choice they've made needs reviewed. But I think it's at that kind of level I would suggest, rather than it's necessarily saying drive it down. But as I say, I do have anxieties in the waste collection disposal side that just now, because we're measuring gross cost and not taking account of income generated, it may seem that councils who are actually trying to do the right thing and should stick with that political commitment and it will pay off over time, get caught just in the cusp of that.
Mark?
Nothing much to add to that. I think the key point from what Colin said is that what we envisaged from the outset for elected members is that this would provide them information and they can then make choices using it to then guide their decisions. And if that's what it does, then I think that's an aid to the democratic decision-making process. But they will have to then stand by the choices that they make. What we've consciously not done is to drive benchmarks, i.e. standard ways of doing things. It's for councils, 32 councils, to reflect the needs and priorities of their communities. This information certainly just adds to the decision-making process for that.
Convener, I think Mr Mayor made an interesting comparison. The museums is one of the ones I've looked at when you've got two neighbouring authorities. And if you count the cost by footfall rather than actual per head of the population, then yes, you will get wide variances, particularly in Glasgow's case, in terms of footfall. So that there is a difficulty in terms of overall cost as a percentage of the budget or as per head of population will be skewed if you are in a local authority area which does have a large visitor attraction that people are prepared to go into, whereas in a smaller authority which may be aspirational to have a museum to identify issues, then that smaller authority, based on this benchmarking criteria, looks as though it's grossly spending too much money on providing museum services compared to a neighbour such as Glasgow. So, and it goes back to the issue earlier about the families, and Mr Hines made reference to looking at comparisons between local authorities, looking at all the different factors where decisions are being made. When are we going to see the families set up? And how quickly can we actually look at that? Because there are issues, and one of the other issues that Mr Mayor made reference to was care for the elderly. But if you look at self-directed support and you look at the increase in expenditure in two local authorities, one local authority year on year is a 15%, shows a 15% increase in expenditure. Another local authority shows 8% increase in expenditure. Those types of decisions being taken at a local level certainly impact on how these benchmarking figures come through. And those wide variances, how do we get to the root cause of the wide variances, as well as making sure that we are comparing as much as possible like with like in terms of service delivery from different authorities.
Ronnie?
Again, the question's very well put. I think in terms of the different variances you get, if you compare on one basis or another, i.e. cost per member of population or cost per footfall, that's partly about the refinement of the indicators that we talked about earlier. So if there's a better way of measuring it, then we will come to that and measure it that way. It's also partly about the kind of drill down aspect of this. Even if the indicator is fine at a high level, once the professionals in that particular area sit with their peers, then the discussion will naturally lead on to, well, it looks as though my unit cost is very high, but how many people do you have going through the turnstile compared to me, and what percentage of your population is that compared to mine? You can see that dialogue unfolding and hopefully a beneficial result coming out of it. And that bears on the families. So the answer to the question about the families is, I will be taking that this week to Solace. As Colin has said, we've been doing that every month that we've met for as long as I care to remember now, but we carry on with it. So we take the question of the composition of the families to my Solace counterparts later this week, and I'm hoping to get a definitive answer to exactly what families we will work with and on what basis.
Okay.
Right, just one final comment on that. I think if you look through the data in the benchmarking framework, it's clear that there are some areas where a family would logically form around councils with quite high levels of deprivation. But that wouldn't be true for every service of that council. So I would not be seeking to explain variations in road maintenance expenditure in terms of the levels of deprivation of the population in those areas. So it may well be that it's not that a council has one family, but for particular service purposes, councils of this family, and for other service purposes of that family. And I think we have to be fluid here. I think the second thing we find when we have explored this in the past is if I end up saying to Glasgow, look, part of your family's Clickmannanshire, yeah, but if you look at the deprivation profile, that would be absolutely right. On the other hand, if you look at the scale, you'll get people in Clickmannanshire saying, why the hell would we want to benchmark with Glasgow and vice versa? So in a way, there's a bit here about balancing a range of factors and having some flexibility around families rather than regarding them as any sort of straitjacket. And I think my final point would be sometimes just learning from someone totally out with your family. They are clearly doing something really, really interesting, and every one of us should now learn from them and not hide behind families. Because I think families can sometimes become an excusatory framework as well as a facilitative one. So I agree that families are important, but I think we have to be flexible and constructive in our use of families rather than rigid and inflexible in our use of families.
Okay. Thank you for your evidence this morning, gentlemen. I have to say that you're not entirely off the hook, because the committee has said right from the very start of this process that it will continue to keep an eye on what is going on. I think that we have got penciled in a return visit sometime in September to see how things are actually going out there and what difference this project is actually making throughout the country. So thank you. We'll see you again soon, and I suspend this meeting for 5 minutes for a change of witnesses, please. Okay. Can we move on now to agenda item 2, which is also a oral evidence session on strand 3 of the committee's inquiry into public service reform. Can I welcome back Colin Mayer and Mark McAteer? Not that you've really been away. Can I also welcome to the committee Ian Crichton, Chief Executive, NHS National Services Scotland, Dorothy Cowie, Director of Scotland XL, and Hugh Carr, Head of Strategic Procurement with Scotland XL. I wonder if Mr. Crichton, you want to give us some opening remarks?
Yeah. I think first off, I'd just like to express my my personal welcome to the committee's interest in shared services. I'd encourage the committee to be ambitious about what Scotland can achieve, and I would suggest to you that in the times we face over the next decade, which we'll be fully familiar with, the country has everything to play for. In terms of national services, Scotland, we've been around for 40 years, so the discussions around whether or not shared services can work are always interesting ones for me. Per the submission I've given you, we cover a range of services. These range from things that you would say are fairly health-specific, such as the blood transfusion service, where we make sure that we get enough blood to meet the needs of our hospital service, all the way through to something like the Central Legal Office, where we have 50 solicitors who do nothing but health business and litigation, property, employment law, and contracts. So we're fairly used to providing a range of shared services. There's lots of reasons why shared services have failed in the past, and I think I would encourage you not to dwell on those. I think learning from the past is important, but thinking about the future more so. We believe there are a range of services we offer that could be used beyond health, and hopefully as we get through the session we'll be able to touch on some of those things that we've actually been testing the water around, to give you a sense of what we so far have found. The NHS itself is an interesting space, because I guess in the previous session I heard somebody say, well, the good thing about the NHS is it has a chief executive for leadership purposes. But actually the NHS operates as 22 different boards, so much more of a federation, I think, than a neatly controlled single point organisation. And so there have been a lot of learning, I think, for my organisation about how you try and keep 22 different chief executives of their own bits of organisation happy and provide an effective service. And I guess what I would end on is sometimes the debate around shared services is far too much around the concept rather than what we're actually trying to achieve. There are genuine benefits of scale from transacting shared services in a country the size of Scotland at national level. I think my organisation, whilst it's a national one, is actually spread across 21 different areas of Scotland. We take a pride in the fact that actually we deliver our services locally where we need to. And I think I'll finish with just making sure I make a clear distinction that shared services for me are not the same as collaborating around the citizen. Shared services my organisation provides basically enable other bodies to do what they're better at than we would be. Thank you.
Do one of our colleagues from Scotland XL want to say a few words?
Please. I just don't want to say too much, but really, again, just to echo Ian's comments, that I welcome the opportunity to, I suppose, share our 5 years' worth of experience. We're about to celebrate our 5th birthday, so not quite as long as the tooth as NHS, but I'm sure the experiences of developing and delivering collaborative contracts and working with councils to help them get better at doing procurement themselves. I hope the experience of that will be helpful. We submitted a briefing paper with the background of what we do and the scale of things, so I don't really want to take the opportunity to regurgitate that, but I look forward to answering your questions about our experiences over the last 5 years.
Mr. Mayor, do you want to say something about the improvement service, please?
Yeah, I mean, improvement service is a shared service governed by COSLA and SOLACE together, but we've also had responsibility for working on their behalf to try and develop a range of shared services across local government and in partnership with colleagues in other parts of the public sector. Two things in the evidence we submitted. One is some reflections upon key factors in being successful with shared services as opposed to unsuccessful, and a case study of probably the largest shared service we directly run, which is Customer First, which operates on behalf of local government, some aspects of the health service and Scottish Government in terms of national transport concession schemes and card services, etc. So no more to add to that than perhaps to echo and reinforce the point Ian made. We have found that if you talk about purpose, here's why we're doing this and here's what it will achieve for people, you've got much more chance of getting engagement and people moving with it than if you talk about shared services, which seems to me to be relatively close to a doomed brand name now. And too often in the past we've pursued shared services for shared services' sake rather than because it actually advanced some practical purpose of efficiency or better outcomes for communities. So that would be the key learning we'd take out from across our experience.
Thank you. Can I start off by asking Mr. Crichton? Obviously, you've said that there are 4 decades of your organisation being in existence. Can I ask, apart from coordinating across the NHS, do you have shared services with other public bodies?
We've had a programme of work over the last year to actually explore it. One of the things that's being laid before the Parliament, I think, as we actually speak, is a public service reform order to give us formal ability to operate beyond the health service. But thus far, we haven't had, if you like, formal ability to do that. So we work in part.
Can I stop you there? In terms of formal ability to do so, is it legislation that has stopped you from doing so, or is it guidance?
The terms of reference for my organisation are quite clear, which is it's there to support the health service.
Okay.
So the public service reform order, which we're consulting with various public bodies on at the moment, and which I guess the Parliament will consider shortly, in whatever form it does that, is around looking at us being able to operate for other bodies who may want our assistance within the public sector.
Okay.
That said, we have been keen, given some of the challenges, and also looking forward to health and social care integration coming to support various Scottish initiatives on a national level beyond health, where we have felt, A, we could add value, and B, where the risks of going marginally beyond our remit were small. So I think probably the most significant one would be, you'll be familiar with McClelland reforms around IT. And we have supported basically the Scottish Government's procurement around a wide area network for Scotland. So one of my shared services is the National Information Systems Group, and we've been doing the technical procurement around that. The reason we can do the technical procurement is because the BT contract that the health service already has in Scotland is very similar in terms of its construct. So it gives, we have a lot of expertise around telecommunications and IT procurement that we can bring to bear to help Scotland. So we lead the procurement of that programme, and essentially we are doing that in partnership with local authorities.
Can I turn to Ms. Cowie and Mr. Carr? I would like you to give us an example, the best piece of procurement that you've done across the board, and how much that has saved during the course of your 5 tender years.
Okay, that's quite a hard one to pick.
I think that should be an easy question to answer. That would be top of my agenda, I have to say.
Well, I suppose in terms of percentage savings, if that's what we look at, probably the one that's delivered the most significant is Washroom Solutions, which isn't a terribly exciting contract. Well, it was just one that was quite fragmented, and the heart of the operation, and I guess one of the things I think makes us successful, is that we don't do things in isolation. We work very much in collaboration with local authorities who come along and inform the strategy.
I'm going to take you back because you've said that Washroom Solutions are the greatest success.
Sorry.
Tell us a little bit more about that and how much it saved, please, if you could.
Can I maybe pick a better one than that? Washroom Solutions was just in terms of the overall percentage. In terms of savings, the contract that gives us the biggest return to local authorities every month is heavy goods vehicles. That's the one that probably gives us the most savings.
What kind of saving are we talking about there?
Hugh's got the numbers there.
and it's Hugh delivers the contract, so I'll let him talk about it in terms of the changes that we've made.
Mr. Carr.
Thank you, Chair. I think that one of the things that's became apparent, and as we've continued to develop our contract portfolio, is that some of the greatest savings come from the most unlikely sources. And I think are testimony to the old adage and the cliche of, regarding economies of scale. So within heavy vehicles, for example, there's an annual spend. When we originally awarded the contract, we had a forecast spend of around £15 million a year. Against the joint collaborative contract, the combined spend is over £20 million a year. And we see savings of the order of approaching 10% on that basis. So, as I said earlier in my opening remark, some of the best contracts come from the unlikely source. And I think that, picking up on a point that Dorothy made, one of the reasons that I can attribute to that is that at the heart of what we do is, in our collaborative contracts, is heavy stakeholder engagement. And we have a very active forum with the local authorities, particularly around roads and transport forum, and the transport managers and the fleet managers, and the result of which is some of the vehicle contracts are yielding savings in excess of what we anticipated, partly because of the degree of stakeholder engagement that we can manage to acquire on that basis.
You're saying that you've achieved 10% savings in that contract across the board. A canny barterer at this moment in time, me for example, could probably go out into the market at this moment in time and get 10% off any vehicle I wanted to buy if I was clever about it. So why do you think that success is down to your organisation rather than anything else, including the current market?
I think it's horses for courses, and the market conditions can be quite challenging. Can I actually unwind and maybe start again? The reason I picked the washroom solutions was just to give you the magnitude of some of the savings that the organisation's been able to deliver. In pound note terms, it's probably not a lot for that one. But it just shows you what the
percentage terms of savings there.
In the washroom solution ones, it was up to about 42% for some councils. So it was not a lot of money, but just, I think for me, and the reason I chose it to give you an example was it shows you the value of the collaboration. There's a couple of other examples, if you would bear with me, that I'd actually quite like to share with you. That I'm always keen to make sure that Scotland Excel is not just seen as being about delivering something at the lowest cost. And part of the portfolio that we started off with, Scotland Excel, the 32-wide organisation, has been in place for 5 years. But it was built on the back of a West of Scotland collaboration, which had been in place since 1996. And I came in 2006 with the remit to develop that to a national approach. Quite a lot of those contracts were the ABC, Authorities Buying Consortium, were very traditional areas that procurement got involved in. So things like exercise books and wheelie bins and some of the vehicles. The whole remit of Scotland Excel would actually to look at some of the high spend areas for local government, which are in construction and social care. And in actual fact, if you ask me to pick out some of the ones that I'm most proud of, it's some of the ones that we've done in those areas where professional procurement haven't really been involved. And we've gone in and I suppose dispelled the myth that that's not an area that you can go into. And some of the benefits that I think we're particularly proud of are not necessarily about cost savings, but they're about improving the outcomes or the relationships, the outcomes to the service users or the relationships that we've got in place with the suppliers.
So where there has been a great change in outcome then, please.
Well, a good example would be our telecare contract. It's very much a monopoly contract, a monopoly market. Local authorities for a long time were incurring quite heavy costs for connecting that telecare equipment with internal systems that they had. and the near monopoly supplier was very reluctant to engage with individual authorities to change the standards that they used. When local authorities got together and went to the market on a consolidated basis, that supplier took that barrier away, which meant that councils were able to connect that equipment up to other services within their own council, and the whole challenge of being able to interoperate those systems was removed, which meant that the services that councils were able to provide were much improved. So we got cost savings on that one, and we took away a lot of additional costs that are hidden for councils and hopefully improved the service.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'll just start with my management gurus, Professor Fred P. Brooks, who wrote a wonderful book in 1974 called The Mythical Man Month. And one of his chapters is on the non-commutativity of time and effort. In other words, it might take 10 hours for one man to dig a grave, but it doesn't mean that 10 men can dig it in 1 hour. And I just wonder, in terms of economies of scale, benefits of scale, that Mr. Crichton referred to, if we were to identify through the aggregation of services that there are actually disbenefits at scale, would you have a process and would you have the courage to recommend abolition of your service?
I'll start at the back and work forward. If I felt my organisation didn't add value to Scotland, I'd be duty bound to recommend its abolition. So I'm very clear with myself around that. Your point around scale is a good one, but I think if you go back to theory, there are economies of scale and there are diseconomies of scale. So the trick is picking the right point, the sweet spot. And that's why I mentioned earlier on that actually you need to start with your purpose as opposed to whether it's a shared service or not a shared service. If you take scale, I think there are two major things Scotland gets from my organisation in terms of scale. The first is, as I said to you, we have 22 health boards. If I can do something once, rather than 22 different health boards doing that same thing 22 times, because there isn't one person to do it, there is a genuine saving from that. I think the second thing is that a lot of the things I do are quite specialised. If I take Health Facilities Scotland, some of my facilities experts, we can only recruit from a pool of about 5 or 10 people in Britain for that level of expertise. You wouldn't have a hope as an individual health board of amassing that kind of expertise in one place, but I can do it for Scotland. So there are definitely some services that I think are hugely beneficial. If I take the Central Legal Office as an example, Scotland's performance around patient litigation around mistakes that are made in hospitals, etc., is, even if you adjust it for pro rata and compare to England, infinitely better. England uses private lawyers, we use public lawyers. Our lawyers, every case they look at, they have an expertise built around knowledge of the NHS. Whilst we keep thinking we've seen it all, perhaps we haven't quite seen it all, but in most cases we've seen something similar before. So we're very, very comfortable with the environment we're working with. We can be quite transparent around our performance. So, for instance, in litigation, you'll look at something, at the end of a litigation, they will publish the costs. They'll publish both sets of lawyers' costs. So we know we're cheaper. We also look at the number of cases that we win, and we perform very well there too. So I think those would be some tangible examples for you of where I think there's genuine scale. Purpose of my organisation is to support Scotland's health, and we're quite clear that patients are extremely important, but patients are very important for the broader health service where territorial boards are hands-on. The patient doesn't need me around the bed, and I don't want to be around the bed. What I do want to make sure of, though, is that there's a bed for the patient perhaps to be in, so we buy the bed and the bed works. I want to make sure that the practice around the patient is safe, so there's a range of services we provide to ensure that. So I think we have a role, and I think there's a real role in shared services around how you enable different organisations to actually deliver the services they need to locally.
I wonder if that might lead on to the previous panel. We were focusing on local government's benchmarking activities. When you centralise, who do you benchmark with? Now there is a single service, and do you do that, and what do you learn from it? And that's not just simply Mr. Crichton. I think that's probably across all three.
Would you like me to? Yeah. I mean, I'll start from saying that we don't centralise, we standardise. So, and it's a very important distinction. So if you take benchmarking as an example, there was a decision taken last year that it would be highly advantageous for Scotland to start to do better with its health service facilities in terms of looking after the estate. So we commissioned essentially a survey of the entire estate. Now that survey was done in partnership with all the different boards, but what we were able to do was commission one survey, so one way of actually doing it across the piece. And from that, that's where we understood the degree of backlog maintenance the current NHS faces. So you generate benchmarking data that is accurate, not variable. You're not dealing with 22 different boards picking a different estate agent or somebody to do the survey. You're actually able to commission a thing and make sure that there's a consistency to the way it's done. Now, in terms of what you do with the results of that, that's for the local areas to work through. But I mean, I listened to your earlier benchmarking session with interest, but I think that's it. You absolutely get that from standardising the way you do things. In terms of centralisation, we have 21 different offices by design because depending on what you're trying to provide depends on where actually we're best deployed.
Excel.
I suppose there's a couple of areas where we benchmark in terms of the contracts. I guess bringing together 32, we're actually benchmarking councils with each other, and that's been a useful learning experience in itself. We actually work quite closely with the others of procurement centre expertise within health, higher and further education, and indeed with central government. So there's kind of benchmarking there. And for some of the areas that are very specific to local government, we would tend to benchmark with England and Wales. We also use market research reports that we buy in. And I guess one of the benefits of doing things like that through an organisation like Scotland Excel, one, we're only having to procure those kind of reports once. And we've actually got the time and the luxury of people who've got the time to go through those assessments. Whereas if it was being done 32 times in councils, then really that kind of level of expertise isn't able to be built up. So that's kind of how we do the benchmarking in terms of the contracts. I found this morning's discussion on benchmarking interesting. In procurement terms, there's a piece of work that goes on again nationally. Ian's organisation carries it out as well, called the Procurement Capability Assessment, and that's a framework that we developed nationally across the procurement community that's used to assess procurement capability both in health, higher and further education, local government and in central government. And we work very closely with Ian's procurement team to make sure that we do that compare and contrast and learn lessons and swap notes and take that forward. I'm very keen that we start to expand the boundaries of that. The procurement capability assessment is really based on a maturity model, and the top level is really kind of world-class procurement, and starting to broaden out from just looking at the public sector. And indeed we had a private sector organisation come along and talk to us at our last annual event so that we could learn some of the lessons of what goes on in private sector and apply the bits that are applicable back to what we're doing in public sector. So that's our approach, if that's helpful.
Mr. Stevenson.
I want to just pick up finally, Convener, on the use of standardisation, because clearly standardisation can deliver short-term benefit, but equally it carries with it the potential of longer-term risk. I think it's captured by the first law of epigenetics. The more highly optimised an organism is for one environment, the more adversely it's affected by change in that environment. So how do you protect against the risks of, if you like, betting the organisation on one good standard solution today that might be whisked away from you in the not too distant future?
I think the answer to that is choosing where you standardise. So if I stay with the legal example I gave you earlier on, it's important to me that we would have a standard approach in terms of customers understanding how they'd engage with us, in terms of the kind of cost they might expect, in terms of the fact that we'd obviously transact under Scots law, that kind of stuff. But what you expect is absolute discretion from each individual lawyer whilst they're dealing with cases, because each case is different, so you can't cookie cutter it. So what you're cookie cuttering, or the choice you're making, is to make sure that the quality of lawyers at a certain level, that the training's at a certain level, that the accessibility is at a certain level, and then you customize the actual service to the client's need. So if you're customer driven, if you're customer centric, if the reason for your service is to generate an outcome for your customer, then I think that's what helps you avoid becoming some big frumpy thing that actually can't move, and that can generate things that look okay from a scale cost perspective, but doesn't bring value in the sense of innovation or new thinking. Dorothy mentioned the capability assessments. Those for me are really, really important, because I have a team that's dedicated to doing it, and it's not my capability they're assessing. What they're doing is they're going out to the different health boards and helping them. And the point of going is that the level of expertise in somewhere like an island board with 3 or 4 people will be totally different to the level of expertise in somewhere like a Glasgow. So actually what we can do is we can help Glasgow get even better, but what they get from us will be quite different to what, for instance, Shetland might get from us. So I think there are a range of ways you can mitigate against the risk you identify, but it's a very valid risk. But again, it's why you need organisations doing it that have an understanding of what they're doing and manage that risk effectively.
Mr. Mayor wants to come in, and then I've got quite a large list, starting with Margaret Mitchell after that.
Just
Mr.
a point
Mayor.
about the standardisation and economies of scale argument. I think one of the issues is we move towards integration rather than aggregation, and that becomes the key focus of public policy in Scotland. If we've standardised in different ways within different parts of the public sector, health, local government and so on, when you then come to say, how do you put together a health and care partnership, you get into your first law of epigenetics here. Which version of standardisation should then characterise how that health and social care partnership goes about its business? So I think there are genuine issues about the way we've conducted standardisation, and very much in support of Ian. I think there are areas where, frankly, the issue is economies of skill and not economies of scale, and that the ability to generate a critical mass of expertise, which could not be done, for example, in any one of 32 councils, but that can be done across them, is right. And then the final point I would absolutely endorse is you pick your targets. We created a thing that's called My Job Scotland, where all councils advertise their employment vacancies on it. It requires a kind of standardised way of putting your job ad out, and so on and so forth. It, however, saves the best part of £5 million per annum for councils. It gets a far better uptake than we ever got in newspaper advertising in the previous ways we did this. So it's a bog standard thing in one sense, but it gives us both a collective presence, takes a lot of cost out of the system, speeds up the process of application, is well viewed by those who use it as applicants, is well viewed by those who use it as councils. So there are areas, I think, where, if you like, you can just say, yeah, we can standardise this. There's no loss to anybody here. Each council can have their own microsites. So if they want to tell you about Argyll and Bute, for example, and how beautiful it is and what a fabby place to work, they can do that in their bit of the site. But you can still have this bog standard process underpins that.
Okay, thank you. John Pentland, do you want to come in on that point?
Yes, it's on that very point, and it was a question I was going to ask later on, but the fact that Mr Mayor has now introduced it was that, you know, I think there's a difference of views as to whether shared services are successful or otherwise. You know, and when I'm looking at your paper, you know, it would appear that in your words, shared services a doom brand name, and you identify, you know, like six key points, which probably gives reasons for that. Do you have any solutions to, you know, why it could be improved? Or why you think it should be?
So I should emphasise when I said I think it's talking about shared services as ends in themselves as a doomed exercise. We need to be talking about purpose, outcome, cost, efficiency, and so on. So my point was where you focus those things, you actually do get leadership, engagement from staff, and so on. Where people see themselves as caught up in an abstract desire to create a shared service, you get a mammoth amount. For instance, my 6 points are there for what you need to have in place to do that consistently. And I think a lot of them almost echo Ian's point. It would be good if we'd all been here for 40 years and therefore had all the information the 40 years had generated. The trouble is, if you're starting with 32 councils, then baselines are really difficult. and I think you'd find that if you look at much of the effort, say, in the Clyde Valley and elsewhere to look at shared services, it got terribly bogged down in the absence of good baselines and benchmarks, frankly, at the outset, and it took so long to rectify that much of the will and impetus and momentum had gone out of it. So I think the more we can improve and standardise the core information we keep, the easier it is to look at where shared services opportunities would arise. But the second thing I think is precision. At the beginning, we generated huge shopping lists of potential shared services, and they were just, in principle, possible to share. There was no other argument for them other than this, here's your shopping list. Terribly back office focused, even though that's actually a very small proportion of the costs of running public services, a tiny fraction. And therefore we got weirdly obsessed with one very narrow area. I think hearteningly, and I've tried to document it in the second paragraph there, a whole lot of things are now happening that are frankly a bit more out there services. You know, how do we get together and collaborate in roads maintenance? We've got a whole range of scientific services which are in the process of being integrated into a single service in Scotland at the present moment, both the council services and SEPA's services in that respect. So how can we get a more robust and resilient framework through that sharing exercise? So my point wasn't that shared services is a bad idea. Talking about it a certain way and using shared service as your brand, all of the things we found it easiest to do, and I include in that PSIF, My Job Scotland, our public notices framework that allows people to go online and pull up the ways in which local authorities will mess up their lives across the next month on their travel to work route and so on, which is shared between councils. All of those things happen because we didn't call them shared services at all. We talked about the purpose, we talked about the outcome to be achieved, we talked about improving the customer service. We never used the term shared service. These ones happen easily. Where people have set up a shared services programme, that appears to create a pattern of resistance almost because we've used that language. So it was an observation on language rather than an observation on the merits of shared services.
Okay, thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Convener. And good morning, everyone, again. Could I ask Scotland Excel, thank you for your briefing paper. In particular, in paragraph 7, you say that Scotland Excel is an example of a successful shared service. You point to the framework contracts and say for every £1 invested in operating costs of Scotland Excel sees a return of £4 in direct cost savings. What would you include in these operating costs?
That's the salary costs are the main thrust of Scotland Excel in our transport. We don't really have very many non-salary related costs. So
when you talk about your HQ in Paisley, are they located in council property? Is there a nominal price put on that? And just how much are your operating costs?
We pay Renfrewshire Council rent for the premises. We're based in Paisley. We've got a couple of staff in Edinburgh, a couple in Highland Council and a couple in Aberdeen. The running cost of the organisation is £3.247 million this year and dropping down slightly next year. And the savings that we generated from the contracts that we put in place, and this is purely the contracts, not any of the other additional stuff about savings that councils might be able to make through the interoperability that I talked about earlier in telecare. Over the last 4 quarters was £16 million we returned back. So that's just
for a baseline every year. So say you've delivered some savings, you start again at year 0, but your overheads are still continuing in terms of your staff, in terms of the market research that you're building in, and every year then you're delivering 1 in 4.
The market research is part of that £3.247 million. So that's one of our extra costs over and above staff. And most of our contracts are in place for sort of 2-3 years, some with an option to extend for 4. We calculate at the start of the contract award process what's the difference between what councils are currently paying and what they're going to be paying through the Scotland Excel contract, and come up with a percentage. And it's that percentage, which is sometimes quite a wide range across councils, that we apply to the spend that we capture from our suppliers that's gone through the contract during that period.
And of that available, do you publish that every year?
We publish, one of our many governance arrangements is to our Chief Executive Officer's Management Group, and every quarter they get a report that shows by council and also by contract the makeup of that £16 million saving. So you can see it across the 32 councils, and you can also see it across our range of contracts.
And your operating costs, is that broken down and published?
Yes.
In the same document?
No, that's a separate. That goes to our joint committee, which is we're governed by a joint committee of 40 elected members.
So it's possible to go and look at that.
Absolutely, yep.
That would be
If there's
interesting
any
just to have a look at that.
Information I can provide, then see if you're having to look. If someone lets me know, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Could I ask Mr. Crichton the same question? How many people are employed in NHS Scotland and across the 8 support kind of services that you've listed?
My organisation employs around 4,000 people, which would be about 3,500 whole-time equivalents. So we and the distribution of that varies hugely based on service. So if we take national procurement, we have a couple of hundred people in national procurement. I think with procurement, we try quite hard to make sure that we don't just focus on savings, because quality of what we buy is really important. It's easy to underestimate the complexity of the public procurement legal landscape now. So what was mentioned earlier on was you could go to the garage and get a 10% discount negotiating on a car. You could, but if you tried doing that within a public procurement arena, you might find, although you might get the discount in the car, you might find yourself in court later on or in breach of EU rules. So there are a lot of very constraining rules, and the question, I think, for Scotland going forward, particularly on big contracts, is how many different people do you want learning those rules? How well joined up are they, for instance, to legal advice around those rules?
Of those constraints, because we hear about constraints in procurement all of the time, and we've heard earlier on the talk about centralisation, standardisation. Do you think that sometimes we make a rod for our own back by trying to procure too many of the same thing at one time, and actually probably drive up cost because you're having to deal with the European rules, rather than drive down costs, which you could possibly do if you had a really good negotiator?
Yeah, no, I don't. The McClelland approach to procurement was quite clear that there's 3 different categories. And it broke that down in what I believe is quite a sensible way. So it recognised that there was a category A, which are some things you could do with just buying nationally. And there are risks around that because you can end up aggregating both demand and supply. But overall, as an approach, it has forced the different sectors to think about how they manage demand, not just what they actually buy. Category B was sector specific. So do you think that's the case
too, that it actually makes folk think a lot more about what they're buying? Because my experience in certain areas, if we take, for example, IT, and we look to schools buying IT, and we looked to end of year, where folk will spend an absolute fortune to get rid of budgets on equipment, which if they actually had spaced the buying over the course of a year, they could have got at much reduced rates than they did.
I think you will find plenty of examples of where people do silly things at end of year. I think what I would say is there's a local authority I'm deployed into support at the moment who have an IT contract that was not a banner negotiation when it was done, but you look at where they got their consulting advice, and it was from the people they bought the IT from. I have a capability to be able to give them advice that is in their interest because I'm acting in the public interest, not the interest of whatever company they choose to use. So I think these are the positives. You will no doubt be able to find examples of where something is bought nationally that could be bought cheaper locally. One of the challenges we have when we buy on frameworks is that once you've done your go-to-market and you've put your framework in place, people who lost have nothing to lose by making much cheaper deals to people who are on the framework who have an option to opt out. But what Health has done over time is work through that culture so that we have a kind of Three Musketeers type approach, which is it's all for one and one for all. We will go out, we'll go to market on certain things, and we will get you a really good deal. In some cases, we'll even be able to shift the market because we can leverage scale. On other things, you may well be better buying them locally yourself. I mean, I think the classic McClelland Category C thing would be taxis. National taxi contracts make no sense for anyone. So I think the important thing for me is that a shared service is a service. It's not. I'm totally against the idea that my place, for instance, would be imposed on bodies to force them to buy things. I think what my place is there to do is to make sure that if we collectively agree that there's benefit in scale, then we'll go to market and we'll get that scale. And my responsibility then to manage the risk. My organisation's responsibility to manage the legal risk. My organisation's responsibility to deal with the market. I mean, the market, and we're majoring in procurement, we do a lot more than that, but if you take the marketplace, I have people who do nothing but develop an understanding of the marketplace. So when they go to the market, they know what they're buying. Doesn't mean I can always secure value, but it means our buyer is well informed.
Okay, thank you. Mrs Mitchell.
Just the total operating costs of NHS Scotland annually.
NHS Scotland, I can tell you, National Services Scotland, we're about 580 million.
Is an analysis and a review always taken of, you know, the various 8 support services to see if there's a better way to do it, if to do it nationally is the best way forward?
Yes. I mean,
and how's
the
that
things,
done?
It works in various ways. I mean, if I stay with, if we do it different, we do it differently for different services.
Else.
Sorry?
If we move off procurement,
all right, yeah.
If
we took something like
information,
if we take IT as an example, there is a steering group that sits above IT that is not part of my governance. It's part of NHS Scotland's governance. And that steering group, we have 2. We have a strategy board who worry about kind of how IT is done across the piece and what we're strategically trying to achieve at national level. And then we have a program board where it's more the techie guys sitting down and comparing who's doing what in IT. Those bodies are the ones that direct the priorities for my organisation, not me. So it enables the stakeholders I'm supporting to influence what we're tasked to do. We report back to those bodies on progress and performance. I also, once a year, am audited in terms of service audits. Those service audits are done so that the service auditor can give assurance to different boards we operate on that we're delivering value for money and that what we've told them we've done is in fact what we've done. So there are a myriad of things like that we do to provide, if you like, reassurance to our customer base.
Where would the problem, and we've heard this out in visits, that computers simply in the health service don't talk to each other. They've got different services. Where would that problem land? Is it you nationally?
I think, again, what I've said is none of my services do, or if you take IT, I don't provide 100% of the IT to the health service. I provide a range of 5 services that are national. Now, one of those services I provide is an integrating service. So that's starting to join different systems together because the IT landscape in the health service is complex and we have things at very different stages. If you look at the journey we've been on over the last 5 years, my organisation has been heavily involved in starting to support NHS Scotland to do better architecture and consulting, to start to think about what are all these different joins and how do they work. Supporting the health service around converging. So, for instance, patient management systems, there used to be 10 different patient management systems 5 years ago. I think today about 70% of Scotland now is on one patient management system. So IT remains challenging, but what my organisation starts to be able to provide people with in that space is expertise at a level that perhaps at local board level we haven't had, and to sort of encourage boards increasingly to sort of make these joins.
Who's taking the leadership in this?
The Health Strategy Board takes the lead in terms of determining what Scotland will prioritise in terms of joining up its national IT.
And you're quite satisfied that your input and the amount of money and what you're providing in this is doing the very best it could and is the best and most effective use of money in delivering probably a service that the IT and computers all talk to each other.
I think we can always do better. One of the challenges in procuring anything, whether it's IT or anything else, is how you get good frontline input into procurement. And quite often in the debate, it becomes this debate about the local procurement department versus the national one. And actually, usually what determines how relevant what you buy is how well you've identified the local needs from people who aren't procurement people at all. So I think strengthening that commissioning area continues to be, I think, a challenge for the NHS and other bodies as well. The better you can get the commission, the procurement stuff is actually the technical bit.
Very important technical bit, I suggest.
It is, but I will suggest to you that most of the failures in the IT procurement space are around the requirements not being properly understood and translated into a contract, and then challenges that organisations have in terms of once you've negotiated the contract, how you actually manage it. We have the Atos contract, which is a huge contract for NHS Scotland. It's a very, very complicated thing to manage, so you need to be able to manage your vendor once you have the contract, not just negotiate the contract. And that, again, is somewhere where I think we can provide strength.
Leadership and overview.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. I should point out I was appointed by Aberdeen City Council to be a representative at Scotland Excel, but never actually managed to get to a meeting because it always ended up clashing with other events. But can I maybe ask of Scotland Excel, are all 32 local authorities signed up to every single procurement that you undertake?
No, they're not. All 32 councils are members, but I suppose to answer a couple of questions, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So councils choose to opt in or opt out. Sometimes the nature of the contract that we are doing doesn't fit in with their overall business model. Sometimes it's because there's a local, there's a kind of specific local issue that needs to be addressed. As Ian outlined, many of our contracts we looked at opportunities, and when we did the analysis, some of it was better fitted to be local. Taxes was one of the ones that we looked at as well. So it's a mixed economy. Most councils participate in most contracts, but not all councils participate in all contracts, if that answers your question.
Because one of the things which, well, I would find it interesting, I'm not sure if the committee would find it interesting, would be to know for the contract portfolio that you've listed in your submission, how many councils are signed up to that contract, what have been the savings that have been realised by those councils who are signed up. I mean, you've spoken about combined savings that have been delivered, but what are the savings that individual councils are realising? I mean, obviously some of that data individual councils may not wish to give, but if that data were able to be available, I think it might be beneficial.
That does form part of the report that goes to the Chief Executive Officer's Management Group that's available on the web. So it's
useful for the committee to catch sight of the most recent report that has gone.
Yep.
Like Mr MacDonald, I'm an anorak when it comes to these kind of things. Mark,
indeed, you taught me well, Convener. Shifting now on to the shared services agenda, and this is perhaps one for everyone to chip on. Although I note in the submission from Colin Mayer that you make the point about the challenge of the long-term realisation of outcomes and savings, and the short-term nature of politics, which is something that I've majored on quite a lot over the years. How do you and how does everyone see us getting beyond some of those blockages that there is a difficult sell for politicians in general to say that if we do something that it will take 10 to 15 years to really see the absolute benefits of it. There may be some benefits that will come quicker, but the optimal benefits will not be realised for another 10 years maybe.
I mean, I think that's a process people are engaged in just now at national and local level around prevention. That if we begin to get better integrated around prevention across the public service, that will pay off, but it won't pay off in any time scale that's directly salient to anybody in this room being re-elected. It will pay off across 10, 15, 20 years, particularly the investments we start to make in very early years, prenatal and so on at the present moment. So in a way, I think with that one, because the pattern of outcomes we've achieved across 50 years are so dire, the case is almost negatively made. We can't conceivably carry on like this because we will simply reproduce that pattern over time. And I think with a lot of shared services, that's the issue. If you want, I mean, I've used the example of, suppose the committee felt someone should explore Payroll Scotland. Should every single Scottish public servant, whoever they are and wherever they are, just be paid through one single payroll system? And surely there'll be economies of scale in that, blah, blah, blah. The honest truth is you would not expect Angus Council to drive that. Angus Council's interested in the people of Angus, the communities of Angus. They've got a perfectly functional payroll system in place just now. So if someone sees 20-year benefits in the total integration of payroll practice across the Scottish public sector, it would almost have to come, I suspect, from government down rather than, if you like, a local council up. So there is a space there about how do you create security around these longer term programmes, because people feel they're often high risk. You get promised benefits 10 years from now, it's like not promising benefits at all, because nobody will be around to notice, and people will have forgotten 10 years from now these benefits were supposed to arrive. So there is a genuine difficulty, I think, within a political system that's geared towards 4 or 5 year cycles, a financial system that's geared to largely 3 year cycles, albeit you can do longer term financial planning, and then the requirements that you would need to put in place for some shared services to make any sense, which is they have much longer term realisation rates than that. Now, whether proceeding by fiat, because in one sense, Ian's organisation is an example of one that exists by a decision of Parliament. It's set up then statutorily, and in one sense you can then develop how best to play that position. If you come at local government, and I think Ronnie emphasised that in the previous session, you've got 32 councils that are independent constitutional entities in their own right. They're self-governing, etc. So they will have to be persuaded there is a good business case in the foreseeable future for going down a shared service. I think the final thing to say, and it reinforces the point both Dorothy and Ian have made about benchmarking, what we found in some contexts, the Clyde Valley programme, for example, was the creation of the benchmarks and the baselines actually caused individual councils to go off and improve massively. So actually, without putting a shared service in place at all, we got a staggering improvement against the benchmarks because people were suddenly aware for the first time of what those benchmarks were. So there are benefits to be had even in exercises where it's concluded there is no good case for creating a shared service. That doesn't mean efficiencies and improvements didn't follow out of that exercise.
On to the other witnesses to answer Mr MacDonald's question. You said there that the Clyde Valley experience then led other councils to go on and improve.
Yeah.
Where's the tangible evidence that there was improvement?
Their own measurement against their own benchmarks. So that, for example, ICT was one of the strands of a potential shared service. It emerged to not have a terribly compelling business case with quite a high risk factor attached to it. But it did give councils ways of comparing their relative performance, costs and so on, and that led to improvement, and they've continued to be used by...
Maybe just change the measures because they've seen that others were measuring in a different way.
Well, that's a proposition I have to say I have not investigated in depth. I'm quite happy to go off and do so and report back to you, but they were using the measures they started from as the benchmarking basis for the shared service case.
I think it would be very interesting for the committee to see whether there were actual tangible changes. You know, because we hear a lot about things improved here, things improved there, but you know, it's very difficult to get the proof of that. So if
Yep.
you could find us that information,
We will.
I think we'd be very grateful. If we could move on to Mr Crichton, back to Mr MacDonald's original question, please.
I guess there's a couple of different things in your question. I think one is, if we take the 5-year political lifespan, what's achievable within that? I don't subscribe that everything worth doing needs to take 20 years. So if we take distribution and warehousing, there was no national capability around distribution and warehousing for the NHS 5 years ago. The Minister for Health at the time made an active decision they wanted it. We put that together, and today every health board in Scotland is serviced from a central distribution point based out of Lark Hall. The benefit isn't just the fact that you have all your goods in one place, or that you have a very resilient distribution network with transport going all over Scotland, even in bad weather. It's the expertise you start to have about how you actually manage ordering of goods at the ward end, at the hospital end, and all the knowledge you accumulate. So we've achieved that in 5 years. There was a business case set out. The committee could have a look at that business case if you wanted to see something tangible in terms of what's been achieved. But it's something that was complex, but because there was a very definite focus, we were able to make progress in a relatively short period of time. Not everything is like that. Some of the really big set piece type stuff, joining information up, sport, health and social care integration, that will be a much bigger thing to bite off. But I think you want a combination of smaller things that can be done that make a big difference, and then bigger things over a longer period of time. I think the other thing I would say, as I told you earlier on, one of the benefits one gets from some of these shared services is expertise. So Colin's familiar with pilots we've been doing with 2 local authorities to just test out expertise we've got and see if it could help. So that's an example of the opposite of what you're perhaps talking about. It's not a big bang thing. It's a small grassroots, put people together with a common interest type thing. And just to give you a flavour of that, in one of the local authorities in one area, we put their facilities people together with our facilities people and just had them start to talk about what could we share that would be helpful. We've got about 14 different things now those people are working on, and they range from the council taking the National Cleaning Services specification the health service have for our facilities and just applying it to theirs, because a lot of science and work's gone into that, so they can use it as it is. They're looking at our facilities monitoring tool, because surprise, surprise, a local authority facility isn't that different to monitor than a health service one. We are working together to introduce, in the NHS we have food, fluid and nutritional standards nationally for hospitals. And surprise, surprise, the people in care homes are not different people to the people in hospitals. Maybe the batting average is a bit older, but the nutritional needs are the same. So these are examples of where you could have 32 councils working all this stuff up. We can keep doing that, or we can actually start to work better together to sort of use things that are well evidenced that work. But I think I get as excited about the small stuff that you can do, trying to do the right thing locally, as I do about the big stuff nationally. I think really we need to be doing both.
And Scotland Excel?
I'd just echo that. I suppose we started 5 years ago, and we were up and running pretty soon, albeit on the basis of what we inherited from ABC. And I think, just again to echo Ian's point, my experience over the last 5 years is when you're trying to change something, we weren't really changing the procurement community, because actually we were plugging a gap that wasn't really there. But from a technical point of view, as Mrs Mitchell said, it's very important that, that's the real key bit. I think there was a little bit of tension there to start with. And our experience is start with something small, and start to build up that trust. And then once you've got the people on board, it's much easier to expand it. And that's certainly been in our experience in things like vehicles and the waste area. We were given a few things because we were a bit of an unknown quantity. People didn't know how we operated. They didn't know what was going to happen. I think there was a bit of fear. So we did a couple of kind of pretty minor contracts, and just through that process of working with the people and getting them used to the Scotland Excel way of doing things, which is very much in collaboration, they are now bringing more and more to the party, and both of those contract portfolios are expanding quite well. So I think it's got to be a mixture of both, and stakeholder engagement and how you build up those relationships is absolutely key, along with the leadership aspect, which we talked about at earlier. That's been absolutely key for us, having elected members support through the joint committee, and equally having the Chief Executive Officers Management Group with 6 of Scotland's Chief Executives support us. I think those are some of the things that are key ingredients for success as far as I'm concerned, on the basis of the last 6 years' worth of experience.
Before I bring in Mr Pentland, I've got one Anurakish question. In terms of some of the procurements that you're making, which are regular, everyday things, do you use the system PCOS by any chance? Do councils use that system to buy into you?
About half of the councils do. It's not universally used across all councils. Some of them have got back office, ledger systems, so they've chosen to use the purchase order module for that. But we develop and deliver catalogues to go into those electronic procurement systems, irrespective of what they use.
Thank you, very useful. Mr Pentland.
Convener, you'll be pleased to know that Mr MacDonald's already asked my question on contract portfolio, so I thank him very much.
Okay, that was brief and to the point. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. My apologies for the earlier part of this evidence session. Just to ask Scotland Excel, thank you for the paper that was presented to us, but in Appendix 2 you actually list contract delivery schedule. In amongst some of the contract delivery schedule you actually refer to fostering adult specialist care and residential children's care. Could you expand on what exactly you're doing in these services? Because I find it strange to, normally you'd expect local authorities deal directly with fostering services and residential children's care. Can I ask why Scotland Excel have been asked to become involved in that type of procurement?
And one of the questions that I think the committee were keen to understand was how these opportunities developed, and those were developed really on the basis of us doing an analysis of spend across the 32 councils. And the areas that we started off with were looking at where there were significant amounts of money being spent with the same suppliers by a vast number of the local authorities in our community. And fostering was one of the ones that came up very early days on that, largely because there are a very small number of very large private foster care providers who came out of that analysis. The total spend was about, when we looked at it, was about £40 million a year, and the vast majority of that was in the handful of maybe about 5 or 6 providers that most local authorities were dealing with, but all of them were dealing with them independently. So that was really the rationale for that contract, which was a couple of years worth of work developing that with, as Ian said, that level of expertise that Scotland Excel's able to pull together with directors of social work and social workers and COSLA and Scottish Government have all been involved in the development of that contract. And that was finally awarded on Friday of last week. The elected members gave us the approval to go ahead and award those contracts.
So I was just going to say, instead of the private foster providers negotiating with individual authorities, what would happen now is local authorities would now go through Scotland Excel, and it would be a flat rate. Just out of curiosity, what would happen if a local authority had negotiated a good rate with the private foster providers, and yet the rate that's been negotiated with Scotland Excel? What guarantee is that rate lower than the rate that they had already negotiated and were working to?
Missed a bit of that evidence. Local authorities can opt out of any of these contracts at all, and I think that's an important thing to re-stress anyway.
The contracts a kind of range of services, so it's hard to do a straight comparison, but most of the councils that are participating in the contract for new placements, they're very keen to use the Scotland Excel frameworks, but it's up to them. There are a number of providers on that framework, and it's a choice for individual local authorities which of those they use. But again, to maybe go back to the very first question, I think there's an awful lot of good stuff being done in that fostering in terms of the arrangements that are in place in the contract, the quality information that's going to come back to local government to help them manage those providers. Some of them are very big international organisations, and the clarity of the expenditure right across local government is missing. They know more about what's going on in local government than local government knows. So that's one of the advantages of putting in place a framework, as we have done, is first of all getting the upfront bits of the contract sorted out and having much more robust terms in place. But equally is the management information that an organisation like Scotland Excel is able to gather and feed back to councils. And in terms of the other ones that you mentioned, those are all areas that have come out from the same perspective. Residential schools, huge amount of work gone into that, and that was really driven again by small number of providers and multi-million-pound expenditure across local government. And the Audit Scotland report a number of years ago that looked at that whole area, that identified that the number of children receiving those services was pretty static, but the costs had gone up significantly over a number of years. So there's been a lot of tension with the suppliers in that market because they're not used to having the degree of scrutiny that we're putting on them about understanding cost drivers. But I hope we've tried to consult with them. We've had a providers group support the development of the strategy, so that if we're trying to develop something that's going to cause them a problem or cause the children who are on the receiving end of that service a problem, then we're trying to iron that out. So we've had a 12-week consultation period on that, and we've got a kind of roundtable discussion on that towards the end of April before we launch the tender. So they're quite unusual for procurement professionals to be involved, but I think on the basis of the experience that we've had today on secure contracts and on fostering. Again, we've built up those relationships with colleagues in both COSLA, Scottish Government, and most importantly with the Association of Directors of Social Work, that actually see the value of what we're delivering back to them, which might not be a reduction in the rate, it's just a much better quality contract.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Just a wee tiny small question added into that. And some of my experience from Glasgow social work, the residential care, the greatest concern that we always had if it was out with a Glasgow area was with the NHS. So did you say that part of that procurement is in collaboration with shared services, that you do speak to NHS? What would normally happen is if it was out with that area, then there was a whole stramash about the NHS because it's a Glasgow child, it's not a Glasgow, and whereby the education and local authority were able then to, they would be able to meet one another with that, but NHS, it was just a no-no, absolute no-no.
I would say we probably haven't cracked that one entirely, but we're certainly, the connections are much easier than they used to be, and because you've not got 32 connecting to however many health boards are, it's a bit easier. So we are working very closely with Ian's procurement team right across the whole health and social care agenda, and in our secure contract, which is kind of another one that involves children, when we did the forensic analysis of what we were paying for, we realised we were paying for the provision of health that the health boards were able to do, but because no one had really been managing those secure providers and analysing the costs, a lot of that was hidden. So we're flushing out lots of things, and now we've got a big pile of things, if you like, to go and find solution to, and the example that you quoted is one of them.
That situation most often was extremely dangerous, yeah, if nothing else, but really frustrating whenever you're looking to the outcome of the best outcome for the child in that instance.
I have one final question for yourself again, and it's round about the procurements themselves. How many of the contracts that you have, or the day-to-day procurement that you make, do you deal with third sector organisations?
We've got a couple of contracts for that are with reserved businesses. Many of the third sector organisations are involved in the areas that are on our development plan in terms of health and social care. So we have a lot of engagement through the provider forums that we've set up with third sector. We've also, we're working with a Scottish Government project called Developing Markets for Third Sectors, and an organisation called, or a consortium called Ready for Business. And their whole raison d'etre is to work with us and to work with local councils to help them develop opportunities for third sectors, and to try and embed more community benefits into the contract clauses that we're making.
Okay. So none of the new social care contracts which you've just signed up to involve third sector at all?
Not to the best of my knowledge. The residential and the some of the further care packages that we're looking at will involve third sector. And one of the things that the Ready for Business team are keen to do, and we're keen to support them, is to find a couple of areas where we could maybe look at doing it through a PSP model, working with third sectors. So we have a huge amount...
PSP model, could you...
public, I've forgotten the social partnership. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So I'll get my PSP, which is third sector models,
yeah.
And there's a couple of examples across local authorities with that, and we're keen to support them moving forward.
I think what would be extremely useful for us is to get an indication of how many deals you have with the third sector as an organisation and how much that business is worth, please.
Okay.
Can I thank all of the witnesses for your time today. I'll suspend and we move into private session.